Hi everyone. This week we're looking at risk assessment and risk management, something which, again, like many of the topics in this unit, might sound a bit boring to start with, and in fact could easily be taught in an incredibly boring way, but I think is actually a really interesting process and a very useful set of capabilities. And I do think if you ever have any chance to be involved in a risk assessment and management process, take advantage of that opportunity or push your way into it, so you can have something in your portfolio that you can show prospective future employers to say, look, I have skills in risk management, and here's some evidence of that. So, yeah. I think part of this is it's one of those so-called 21st century skills that don't fall into the old categories of, management or doing the books or doing this or doing that, that has arisen, that there's been demand for skills that have outstripped the the people who have those skills. So people who do have skills, who do have experience with risk management, and practical, not necessarily, I did some courses on it, some practical skills, risk management experiences are very much sought after. And so the question really is, well, why is that? Why is this something that has not been anticipated, that we haven't gotten behind as a society beforehand? And here I turn to the work of Beck, the social theorist, not the Scientologist pop star. And Beck talks about the rise of risk society, which we look at in a few of the resources this week. And he says this is a transformation that has occurred through the last part of the 20th century and into the 21st. And like many changes, it is more difficult to see when you're in the center of those changes than it is necessarily from the outside. And he said there's a variety of different historical factors that have moved us from a society, and multiple societies in the West, that purely move on the basis of policy, in terms of, well, what do we think is, the good for our society, what's best for us, to also including estimations of risk quite heavily. And a few things have been discussed as causes for this. One is the changes to the geopolitical situation in that time, particularly the Vietnam War, where previously wars had been fought, even, the world wars had been fought with this idea of separate countries and separate conflicts. And what became very clear in the conflicts around the time of the Vietnamese War, as they call it in Vietnam, the American War, were this sense of interdependencies between countries and the knock-on effect that would happen, particularly the way proxy wars were being fought by the Soviet Union and China on the communist side, and America on the other side, using other countries as pawns. And this sense of, let's say, ecological interdependence, and I don't mean that in a positive environmental way, but this idea that the environment is all interconnected and that moving one thing can cause a cascade of other effects. This is the thing Kissinger called the realpolitik. That very much has informed this change, that we move from this previous idea of, well, if we think it's the right thing to do, we'll do it, to this background of, well, we've got to look at all the options first, because every time we do something, it produces all these other negative effects. The same comes to economic interventions. People used to, and some economists still have this faith in the old way of dealing with economies. If you've got an increase in inflation, you deal with it by raising interest rates, and that fixes the problem. But again, in that same time, we saw this increasing understanding that things don't happen that simply, And usually when you change one thing, it upsets a whole lot of different other things. So that's what I mean by an ecological sense. It's not that people are necessarily more respectful of the environment, but people are more aware that the context we work in has this finely balanced, finely tuned ecology. Well, maybe it's not even finely tuned, but it's precarious, let's put it that way. It's a situation where a small change can make major effects down the track. So those are some of the things that we talk about when we talk about this rise of risk society. We've also, of course, got the rise of world-ending technologies, such as, nuclear weapons, the risks from nuclear power, the risks of things like Chernobyl, which is referred to in the notes, risk of environmental collapse. We've got a whole lot of risks that are not the same risks of 100 years ago. Where the worst something could happen would be something might blow up. And now we actually see that just, blowing up one thing blows up everything in a lot of environments. So that tends to make for more cautious policy making. And those macro scale global issues have a way of affecting locally made policy. And, in criminal justice, we have the same thing. We have this idea, growing consciousness that some of these problems that are very difficult to solve, we can sometimes do more harm than good through interventions. I think I've mentioned previously Cabrini Green, which was one of the housing projects in the US. In the UK, they called them, what did they call them? Housing developments. But this idea that we could actually fix a lot of social issues, one of which was crime, but also looking at poverty, drug addiction, education, all those interconnected things, by moving people out of the slums and building brand new, purpose-built, often tower-based accommodation that would move people out of those environments of poverty and put them into new environments. And that did not work. That backfired in a spectacular way. And most of the housing projects in the US have been demolished in the meantime. And one of the worst of which, Cabrini Green in Chicago, features heavily in the original, if you're a horror movie fan at all, the original Candyman film. And of course the same location is in the new recent Candyman film, which revisits the same place in its new gentrified environment. But Cabrini Green essentially ended up being run by the gangs because all the they didn't actually address any of the problems of the slums, and in many ways they amplified the problems through the physical design of the space. So housing estates is what they called them in England. We do things in terms of low-income housing in Australia too, and there's some fairly notorious tower blocks in Melbourne that had all sorts of problems during COVID because of the way they were approached. So, yeah, in the criminal justice area, I think we're increasingly aware of risk on an individual basis. Is this client someone who's going to be a further danger to other people and themselves? And on a systems level of, is this new system or program or new pilot project, what is it going to mean? What is going to be the medium and long-term effects of this? And every proposal we now have for change has to include this understanding of risk and assessment of risk. So there's lots of tools and ideas in this week's readings. I recommend the idea of the risk matrix, this is one that comes from public health, and this idea of developing this risk matrix around activity, I think, is a good one. Of course, in the pandemic era, a lot of our policy around risk has been, what's the word for it? Very, very much acute in a way that it hasn't been before. And one of the things I think is interesting about COVID, and looking back on it now, or not looking at it now because it's becoming an increasing problem again, was that during the early days of COVID, we did not know how bad it was going to get. And one of the things about prudent risk management was you had to allow for a whole range of strategies depending on whether COVID was just going to blow over overnight or whether it was going to become some kind of deadly plague that was going to really destroy societies. As it's turned out, it's one we've recovered from, but it's also one that we've tried to sort of sweep under the carpet to a certain extent. And given that we're likely to have pandemics, if not global pandemics, but pandemics every 4 or 5 years, there are questions about, well, how prepared are we? What have we learned from the risks of COVID? And I suspect in some places not a lot, or we've learnt the wrong things. Okay, so there's a bit of discussion about risk forensics that I think is an interesting process, and that's where pardon me, where you go into a process of trying to determine what risks are potential, and what their likelihood is, and what strategies there are to deal with them. So that means going into any project with your eyes open and being able to plan around the terrible things that could happen, which does sound a little like one of my family vacations growing up, and is not necessarily, risk out of control. If you don't balance the risk management part of planning, you end up doing nothing, because all you do is see the risks, and all you do is you see the problems that could occur. And in fact, I can't remember who it was, but one of those Silicon Valley entrepreneurs said that unless a third of your projects fail, you're not taking enough risks. And while I'm the last person to try and, elevate Silicon Valley tycoons to, some higher status as philosophers, there is an element of truth of that, and you end up with if you have risk-averse cultures and risk-averse organisations, that can be as much of a problem, because people are too afraid to change. They're too afraid of the risks. So there's some other interesting stuff about data and collecting data around risk that I think will hopefully be of some interest to you. And I think we'll try and give a bit of texture to this idea of risk assessment, so it doesn't just seem like this dry, abstract process of working through the numbers. That it is this dynamic thing that is not, there's no one good process. There's lots of tools and lots of ideas, but basically you need really good risk managers on the ground in a part of any project who are going to be able to localize those ideas and really focus them on getting the best outcomes. And as I said, risk management is not just reducing risk. It's about finding the right level of risk that is, appropriate, that you can handle. If things go wrong, you can handle it, but you're also taking enough risk that you're actually pushing things forward and enabling change. And that'll come into the workshop for this week's, the challenge for this week's workshop, which looks at part of the scenario, which of course we're not using this year, but it looks at the red cap incident, which is a mysterious incidence of violence in the community that's got some kind of medical foundation, because people are bleeding from the scalp when they're affected by it. But we still don't, at this point in the scenario, know what's causing it. And that raises really interesting risk questions around, is this a disease? Is this a result of a new drug that's around, the notorious bath salts drug that appeared in our mythology a few years ago? There's social conditions around this. All these interesting, open, sort of research-oriented questions, but in terms of policy making and strategy, you've got to do something now. You can't wait until someone finds out what causes it. And you have to try and make decisions, the right decisions in the short term, that you're not going to regret later. So I think it's an interesting scenario, and I guess we'll see what you make of it.